The sound of someone trying to unlock your front door at 2 a.m. is something that changes you forever. That metallic scraping of keys against deadbolt, followed by the soft click of tumblers falling into place, followed by absolute silence, as whoever just broke into your house realizes they've made a terrible mistake. My name is Alex Thompson, and I've been David's personal assistant and security coordinator for 18 months. In that time, I've dealt with obsessed fans, paparazzi with telescopic lenses, and record label executives who think contracts are suggestions. But nothing prepared me for a 35-year-old HOA president in tennis whites who decided that community oversight included the right to break into residents' homes. Let me set the scene. David had just finished his North American tour and was taking some well-deserved downtime at his house in Malibu Vista Estates, one of those gated communities where the HOA fees cost more than most people's cars and every blade of grass is monitored for compliance violations. The house sits on 3 acres of perfectly manicured landscape, complete with a recording studio, infinity pool, and enough security systems to protect a small embassy, or so we thought. It was Tuesday night, and David was in the studio laying down tracks for his next album. I was in the main house reviewing tour settlements when the security system chimed with an exterior motion alert. Nothing unusual about that. We get alerts from raccoons, delivery drivers, and the occasional lost tourist who wandered past the community gates. But this alert was different. The motion sensors showed someone moving systematically around the perimeter of the house, not randomly like an animal or lost person would move. Someone was conducting surveillance, checking windows and doors with the methodical precision of someone planning an entry. I pulled up the security camera feeds on my laptop and felt my blood run cold. There she was, Karen Whitmore, 35 years old, wearing her signature white tennis outfit even at midnight, carrying what appeared to be a professional locksmith kit and a clipboard. She was testing every ground floor window and door, taking notes and photographing entry points with the casual confidence of someone who believed she had every right to be there. Karen had a reputation in Malibu Vista Estates that preceded her like a toxic cloud. She'd been elected HOA president 6 months earlier on a platform of community accountability and standards enforcement, which turned out to be code for systematic harassment of residents who didn't conform to her vision of suburban perfection. But this was beyond harassment. This was criminal reconnaissance for what appeared to be breaking and entering. I immediately called Detective Linda Ramirez with the Malibu Sheriff's Department, who I'd worked with on previous security issues. When I explained what I was witnessing on the security feeds, her response was immediate and professional. "Mr. Thompson, what you're describing sounds like preparation for criminal trespass or burglary. We can respond immediately, but if you're comfortable with it, we might want to let this play out and catch her in the act." Breaking and entering carries much more serious charges than attempted breaking and entering. The idea of letting Karen actually enter the house was terrifying, but Detective Ramirez had a point. If we wanted to stop her pattern of escalating harassment and criminal behavior, we needed evidence of actual crimes, not just attempted crimes. How would that work? We position officers inside the house before she makes entry. When she breaks in, she's immediately confronted by law enforcement and arrested for burglary in progress. No ambiguity, no legal gray areas, just clean arrest and prosecution. 30 minutes later, I was letting Detective Ramirez and Officer Michael Santos into the house through the back entrance, while Karen continued her perimeter surveillance. The plan was simple. I would monitor the security feeds from the studio with David, while the officers positioned themselves in the main living room, where any intruder would have to pass. "Thompson," Detective Ramirez said as she tested her radio equipment. "Once she enters the house unlawfully, we have her on felony burglary. In California, that's up to 6 years in state prison. Are you prepared for this to go that far?" "Detective, she's been systematically harassing residents for months, and now she's planning to break into someone's home. If we don't stop her here, where does it end?" David emerged from the studio to find his house occupied by law enforcement officers, preparing to arrest his HOA president for breaking and entering. His reaction was exactly what I'd expected, a mixture of outrage and fascination. "She's really going to try to break in?" According to the security feeds, she's been testing entry points for over an hour. She's got locksmith tools, a camera, and what appears to be some kind of official-looking documentation. David pulled up the live camera feeds on the studio monitors, where we could watch Karen's methodical preparation in real time. She'd moved to the front door and was examining the lock mechanism with a small flashlight, occasionally consulting her clipboard like she was following written instructions. "What's her legal justification for this?" David asked. "There isn't one. HOA authority doesn't include the right to enter private homes without permission. What she's doing is straight-up criminal trespass preparation. Detective Ramirez's voice came through our radio system. Suspect is at the front door with what appears to be lock manipulation tools. All units in position and ready. The waiting was excruciating. We could see Karen on the security monitors working at the front door lock with professional-grade tools and obvious experience. This wasn't some desperate improvisation. She knew what she was doing, which raised disturbing questions about how many other homes she might have entered illegally. At 2:17 a.m., the front door opened. Karen stepped into David's house wearing her pristine white tennis outfit, carrying her clipboard and a small flashlight, moving with the confident authority of someone who believed she had every right to be there. She paused in the entryway, consulting her clipboard like she was following some kind of inspection protocol. That's when Detective Ramirez stepped out of the shadows with her service weapon drawn and her badge clearly visible. Malibu Sheriff's Department, you're under arrest for burglary. The sound Karen made was unlike anything I'd ever heard, a combination of shock, terror, and indignation that somehow managed to convey complete disbelief that her actions had consequences. She dropped her clipboard, which scattered official-looking papers across the marble floor, and raised her hands with the jerky movements of someone whose brain was struggling to process reality. "I'm conducting an HOA compliance inspection," she stammered, apparently believing that community authority trumped criminal law. "I have the right to verify resident adherence to community standards." Detective Ramirez approached with professional caution while Officer Santos moved to secure the scattered documents. "Ma'am, HOA authority doesn't include the right to break into private homes. You're being arrested for first-degree burglary. This is harassment," Karen declared, even while being handcuffed in someone else's living room at 2 a.m. "I'm the HOA president, and I was conducting legitimate community oversight." The disconnect between reality and Karen's perception was staggering. She'd broken into someone's home using professional locksmith tools, but she was portraying herself as the victim of harassment by the people whose house she'd illegally entered. As Officer Santos read Karen her rights, Detective Ramirez examined the documents she'd dropped. "Mr. Thompson, you need to see this." The papers scattered across the floor weren't just random HOA forms. They were detailed floor plans of David's house, including security system locations, entry points, and what appeared to be a systematic inspection protocol for searching the property without the owner's knowledge or consent. "Where did she get architectural plans of my house?" David asked, appearing in the doorway as Karen was being led outside in handcuffs. Detective Ramirez held up one of the documents. "These aren't just floor plans. These are detailed security assessments, including camera locations, alarm system specifications, and entry vulnerability analysis. This represents significant planning and preparation." The scope of Karen's criminal enterprise was becoming clear. She hadn't just decided to break in on a whim. She'd conducted detailed reconnaissance, obtained professional locksmith tools, and prepared systematic documentation for conducting illegal searches of residents' homes. "Detective, how many other homes might she have entered?" "That's exactly what we're going to find out. This level of planning and documentation suggests she's done this before." As Karen was placed in the back of a patrol car, still wearing her tennis outfit and still insisting that she was the victim of some kind of misunderstanding, I realized we'd caught more than just an overzealous HOA president. We'd exposed what appeared to be systematic criminal invasion of residents' privacy disguised as community oversight. The investigation that would follow would reveal the true scope of Karen's criminal activities and transform how communities thought about the limits of HOA authority. But for now, it was enough to know that someone who'd terrorized residents with clipboard violations was facing 6 years in state prison for thinking that community leadership included the right to break into people's homes. Sometimes justice comes through legal proceedings and proper channels. Sometimes it comes through police cooperation and criminal prosecution. And sometimes it comes through the simple recognition that certain behaviors are crimes regardless of what kind of authority you think you have, or what kind of tennis outfit you're wearing when you commit them. Karen Whitmore had just discovered that HOA presidency doesn't include locksmith privileges, home invasion rights, or immunity from criminal prosecution. The look on her face when she saw Detective Ramirez step out of the shadows would haunt my dreams for weeks, not because it was terrifying, but because it was so perfectly satisfying. By Thursday morning, Karen Whitmore had achieved something most criminals spend their careers trying to avoid. She'd become the subject of a multi-agency investigation that was expanding faster than wildfire through dry brush. What started as a simple burglary arrest had evolved into something much more complex and disturbing when investigators began examining the documents she'd brought to David's house. I was in David's kitchen, reviewing security footage with Detective Ramirez, when she received the call that changed everything. Her expression shifted from professional interest to genuine concern as she listened to whoever was on the other end of the line. "Mr. Thompson," she said after hanging up, "we need to talk. The documents Karen dropped in your living room weren't just floor plans. They're part of what appears to be a systematic surveillance operation targeting multiple residents in your community." She spread out photocopies of the papers Karen had scattered across David's marble floor when she was arrested. What I'd initially thought were random HOA forms turned out to be detailed intelligence files on at least 12 different households in Malibu Vista estates. Each file contains architectural plans, security system specifications, daily routine observations, and what appears to be vulnerability assessments for forced entry, Detective Ramirez explained. "This isn't random harassment, Mr. Thompson. This is organized criminal enterprise." The scope was staggering. Karen hadn't just planned to break into David's house. She'd been conducting systematic surveillance on numerous residents, documenting their security weaknesses, and preparing for multiple illegal entries. The files included photographs taken through windows, schedules of when residents were typically away, and detailed notes about valuable items visible in each home. And based on the level of detail in these files, she's been at this for months. David emerged from his home studio wearing the expression of someone who just realized his privacy had been violated in ways he hadn't imagined. "Alex, I've been going through the security footage from the past 6 months. Karen's been conducting surveillance on this house since at least February." He showed us edited clips from various dates, all showing Karen at different times and locations around his property. Sometimes she was wearing jogging clothes, sometimes her usual tennis outfit, but always carrying some kind of recording device or camera. The pattern was unmistakable, systematic reconnaissance conducted over months of careful observation. She wasn't just planning one break-in, David continued. She was studying the entire property, mapping security blind spots, and timing guard rotations and staff schedules. The professionalism was disturbing. This wasn't impulsive criminal behavior or someone who'd snapped under pressure. This was calculated, methodical preparation for large-scale burglary operations disguised as community leadership activities. Detective Ramirez received another call, and this one made her reach for her notepad with obvious urgency. That was the crime lab. The locksmith tools Karen was carrying aren't standard consumer products. They're professional-grade equipment used by security professionals and, unfortunately, experienced burglars. How experienced are we talking about? The tools she had cost over $3,000 and require specialized training to use effectively. These aren't things you buy on Amazon and figure out from YouTube videos. The implications were clear. Karen wasn't an amateur who decided to break into David's house on impulse. She was someone with professional-level skills and equipment who'd been planning systematic criminal operations throughout the community. "Mr. Thompson, we need to expand this investigation immediately. Based on what we've found, Karen Whitmore represents a significant threat to community safety, and we need to determine how many other homes she may have illegally entered." That afternoon, Detective Ramirez coordinated with the FBI's Property Crimes Unit to launch a comprehensive investigation into Karen's activities. The federal involvement was triggered by the sophisticated nature of her operation and the potential for organized criminal enterprise charges. Special Agent Jennifer Walsh arrived that evening to review the evidence and coordinate the expanded investigation. Her first question set the tone for everything that followed. "Mr. Thompson, how long has Karen Whitmore been HOA president, and what kind of access does that position give her to resident information?" "She's been president for about 6 months. The position gives her access to architectural plans filed with the HOA, security system registration information, and emergency contact details, including when residents are traveling." Agent Walsh reviewed Karen's surveillance files with the methodical attention of someone who'd seen similar cases before. This is organized criminal enterprise using community leadership as cover for intelligence gathering. The level of detail and preparation suggests she's done this type of operation before. The FBI background check on Karen revealed information that made everyone involved in the investigation reconsider the scope of what we were dealing with. She'd held HOA or community leadership positions in 4 different upscale communities over the past 8 years, and each tenure had ended with mysterious resignations followed by reports of increased property crime in those areas. "Agent Walsh, are you saying she's been running this same operation in other communities?" "That's what we're going to find out. But the pattern is consistent. Gain community leadership position, access resident information, conduct systematic surveillance, then execute burglary operations while maintaining plausible deniability as a concerned community leader. The investigation expanded to include communities in Nevada, Arizona, and Colorado, where Karen had previously held leadership positions. Preliminary findings suggested property crime rates had increased by 40 to 60% during her tenure in each location, with burglaries showing sophisticated planning and inside knowledge of resident schedules and security systems. David's reaction to learning about Karen's apparent criminal history was immediate and decisive. "Agent Walsh, I want full federal prosecution. This woman has been using community trust to facilitate criminal operations, and she needs to face consequences that will prevent her from victimizing other communities." "Mr. David, based on the evidence we've gathered, we're looking at potential charges including organized criminal enterprise, burglary, criminal trespass, stalking, and wire fraud. If convicted on all counts, she's facing 15 to 20 years in federal prison." The community reaction was swift and intense once word spread about the scope of Karen's operations. Residents who'd thought they were dealing with an overzealous HOA president realized they'd been living under surveillance by someone planning systematic criminal violation of their homes and privacy. Mrs. Helen Foster, who lived 3 houses down from David, called me that evening with information that made the investigation even more disturbing. "Mr. Thompson, I need to tell you something about Karen that I should have reported months ago." "What is it, Mrs. Foster?" "She's been in my house multiple times. She claimed it was for HOA compliance inspections, but now I realize she was cataloging my belongings and security arrangements. She photographed my jewelry, my electronics, even my prescription medications." The pattern was becoming clear. Karen hadn't just been planning burglaries, she'd been conducting them under the guise of HOA inspections. Residents had allowed her into their homes because they trusted her authority, not realizing they were being surveilled for future criminal activity. "Mrs. Foster, how many times did she inspect your house?" "At least 4 times over the past 3 months. Each time she claimed she was checking different compliance issues: air conditioning efficiency, electrical safety, interior maintenance standards. But she spent most of her time photographing things that had nothing to do with HOA regulations." Agent Walsh prioritized Mrs. Foster's interview when I relayed the information. Within hours, they'd identified 8 other residents who'd allowed Karen into their homes for various inspection purposes, each time resulting in detailed photographic documentation that had nothing to do with community standards. "This is worse than we initially thought," Agent Walsh told me after interviewing the affected residents. "She wasn't just planning burglaries, she was conducting them in plain sight by convincing residents that her criminal surveillance was legitimate HOA business. The legal implications were staggering. Karen had committed multiple counts of criminal trespass, theft by deception, stalking, and burglary preparation while using her elected position to gain access and credibility. The abuse of community trust elevated her crimes from individual offenses to systematic violation of civic responsibility. Friday morning brought news that would ensure Karen's case became a landmark prosecution for community leadership accountability. The attorneys general in 4 states announced a joint investigation into HOA governance and oversight, using Karen's case as evidence that community leadership positions needed enhanced background screening and legal accountability measures. As I reviewed the week's developments, I realized that what had started as strange motion sensor alerts had uncovered one of the most sophisticated community-based criminal enterprises in recent memory. Karen Whitmore had spent years perfecting a system for using civic leadership to facilitate systematic property crime, and her arrest at David's house had finally exposed her entire operation. The break-in that never happened had prevented crimes that could have devastated an entire community. Sometimes the best security system isn't technology or guards, it's the simple recognition that some people use positions of trust to facilitate behavior that violates everything those positions are supposed to represent. Karen was facing decades in prison for turning community leadership into criminal opportunity. The investigation would continue for months, but her days of using HOA authority to facilitate burglary operations were permanently over. Saturday morning brought the kind of media chaos that transforms quiet gated communities into national news events. By 8 a.m., Malibu Vista Estates was surrounded by news vans, investigative reporters, and what appeared to be half of Los Angeles County's law enforcement community. The story of an HOA president arrested for breaking into a celebrity's home had exploded across every platform, but the real bombshell was yet to come. I arrived at the community center for the emergency HOA meeting to find it packed beyond capacity. Every resident seemed to be there, along with FBI agents, local detectives, and enough media to cover a presidential campaign. The atmosphere was electric with the kind of tension that comes from a community realizing their trusted leader had been planning to rob them blind. David was there too, wearing dark sunglasses and a baseball cap in a futile attempt at anonymity. The sight of news crews setting up outside his house had convinced him that community involvement was now unavoidable. "Alex," he said as we found seats in the back, "I've never seen anything like this. Mrs. Peterson from 2 houses down just told me Karen photographed her jewelry collection during a fake air conditioning inspection." The revelations were coming fast and steady. As residents compared notes about Karen's various inspection visits, a pattern emerged that was even more disturbing than the FBI investigation had initially suggested. She hadn't just been planning burglaries, she'd been conducting systematic intelligence-gathering operations disguised as routine community management. Board member Janet Morrison called the meeting to order with the shell-shocked expression of someone who'd discovered her organization had been infiltrated by a career criminal. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're here to address the recent arrest of our former president and the ongoing federal investigation into her activities." The word "former" carried weight. Karen's arrest for felony burglary had automatically terminated her position, leaving the community scrambling to understand the scope of what they were dealing with. FBI agent Walsh took the podium with the kind of authority that made the room go completely silent. "Residents of Malibu Vista Estates, I'm here to brief you on our investigation into Karen Whitmore's criminal activities and to request your cooperation in determining the full extent of her operations." She presented evidence that made the room collectively gasp. Karen's surveillance files contained detailed information on 23 different households, including photographs taken through windows, schedules of daily routines, inventory lists of valuable items, and security vulnerability assessments that would have impressed professional burglars. The defendant used her position as HOA president to gain access to architectural plans, security system information, and travel schedules that enabled sophisticated criminal planning, Agent Walsh continued. "We have evidence suggesting she conducted illegal surveillance and potentially unauthorized entry of multiple homes under the guise of community inspections." Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield, a dignified woman in her 70s who lived on the community's most exclusive street, stood up with obvious difficulty. "Agent Walsh, I need to report something that I thought was just overzealous management, but now I realize was criminal activity. What can you tell us, ma'am?" "Karen conducted what she called a security assessment of my home 3 weeks ago. She photographed my jewelry, my art collection, and my prescription medications. She also asked detailed questions about my travel plans and when I'm typically away from the house." The room erupted in angry murmurs as other residents began connecting their own experiences to what Mrs. Whitfield was describing. Agent Walsh raised her hand for silence. "Mrs. Whitfield, did Karen enter your home with your permission?" "Yes, but only because she said it was required for HOA compliance. She claimed the community's insurance policy required annual security assessments of all homes. I trusted her because she was our elected president." That's when the scope of Karen's fraud operation became clear. She hadn't been breaking into homes randomly. She'd been using her authority to gain legitimate access, then conducting criminal surveillance while residents believed they were cooperating with community requirements. "Ladies and gentlemen," Agent Walsh announced, "anyone who allowed Karen Whitmore into their home for any kind of inspection or assessment needs to speak with federal investigators immediately. What you thought was community compliance may have been preparation for criminal activity." The line of residents wanting to report suspicious inspections stretched around the community center. David and I watched in fascination as the full scope of Karen's operation was revealed through dozens of individual testimonies. Mr. Robert Chen, a tech executive who lived near the community entrance, provided testimony that showed Karen's operation was even more sophisticated than anyone had realized. "She didn't just photograph my electronics and jewelry. She asked technical questions about my security system, including alarm codes and monitoring company information." Agent Walsh made notes with obvious concern. "Sir, did she request access to your security system controls?" She said the HOA needed to verify that all systems met community standards for response times and reliability. "I gave her a tour of the entire setup because I thought it was legitimate oversight." The pattern was consistent across multiple households. Karen had used fabricated HOA requirements to gain access to security systems, obtain alarm codes, and document valuable property locations. She'd essentially convinced residents to provide her with everything she needed to successfully burglarize their homes. Detective Ramirez took the podium to address the criminal investigation timeline. "Based on our findings, we believe Karen Whitmore was planning coordinated burglary operations targeting multiple homes during the upcoming holiday season when many residents would be traveling. The timing made perfect sense. Karen had spent months gathering intelligence and would have executed her crimes when the community was least occupied and most vulnerable. The scale of potential theft and property damage could have reached millions of dollars. "Detective, how many homes were targeted for burglary?" asked a resident from the middle of the packed room. "Based on the surveillance files and intelligence documents we recovered, at least 15 homes were in active preparation for illegal entry. However, we're still analyzing evidence and the number may be higher." David leaned over to whisper in my ear. "Alex, she was planning to rob half the neighborhood while serving as their elected president. The audacity is staggering." The community's response was immediate and comprehensive. Board member Morrison announced that all of Karen's administrative actions would be reviewed by independent auditors, all community security protocols would be redesigned, and enhanced background screening would be implemented for all future leadership positions. "We also want to establish a victim support fund for any residents who suffered losses due to Karen's criminal activities," Morrison added. "This community will not let her crimes divide us or compromise our commitment to mutual support and security." But the most dramatic moment came when Agent Walsh announced the expansion of criminal charges against Karen. "Based on evidence gathered from community members, we're adding charges of organized criminal enterprise, identity theft, fraud, and conspiracy. Ms. Whitmore is now facing a potential sentence of 25 to 30 years in federal prison." The room fell silent as the weight of those numbers settled in. Karen's plan to use community leadership for systematic burglary operations would likely result in her spending the rest of her productive adult life in federal custody. As the meeting concluded, residents gathered in small groups to share their experiences and process the scope of what they'd discovered. The community that had trusted Karen with their safety and property management was learning to rebuild trust in their institutions and each other. David approached several neighbors to offer his private security consultant services for reviewing their home protection systems. "What happened here could happen in any community," he told Mr. Chen. "The only way to prevent it is through transparency, accountability, and genuine community cooperation." The media response was immediate and intense. By Sunday morning, Karen's mugshot was appearing on national news alongside analysis of HOA governance and community security. Legal experts were calling her case a watershed moment for understanding how positions of civic trust could be exploited for systematic criminal enterprise. Foster approached me as we were leaving the community center. "Mr. Thompson, I wanted to thank you and David for stopping her before she could execute whatever she was planning. If you hadn't caught her in the act, we might have all been victims of burglary operations that we'd helped her plan through our own cooperation." As we drove back to David's house, passing news crews and federal investigators still processing evidence, I reflected on how quickly a community's entire understanding of safety and trust could be shattered by one person's criminal exploitation of civic responsibility. Karen Whitmore had spent months building detailed intelligence files on her neighbors while they trusted her to protect their community. Her arrest had prevented crimes that could have devastated multiple families, but it had also revealed how vulnerable communities could be to systematic criminal exploitation disguised as legitimate leadership. The investigation would continue for weeks, but the community healing had already begun. Sometimes the most important security system isn't technology or guards, it's the recognition that real leaders earn trust through service and transparency, not through exploitation and deception. Karen was sitting in federal detention facing decades in prison for turning community presidency into criminal opportunity. The residents she'd planned to victimize were working together to ensure that their trust would never again be exploited by someone who mistook leadership for license to commit crimes. Monday morning brought news that would define the rest of Karen Whitmore's legal battle. Her third attorney in 5 days had withdrawn from the case. The Los Angeles County Jail's phone logs showed she'd been making increasingly desperate calls to law firms across California. But few attorneys wanted to defend someone whose crimes had been documented with the thoroughness of a federal task force operation. I was in David's kitchen, reviewing security footage with Detective Ramirez, when Agent Walsh called with an update that made everyone involved in the case reconsider what we thought we knew about Karen's criminal enterprise. "Mr. Thompson, we've been analyzing the financial records associated with Karen's activities, and we've uncovered evidence that suggests her burglary operation was more sophisticated than we initially realized. She wasn't working alone." The implications hit immediately. If Karen had accomplices, the investigation would need to expand beyond her individual crimes to encompass a larger criminal network that had been using HOA positions to facilitate systematic property theft. "Agent Walsh, how many people are we talking about?" Based on preliminary evidence, we've identified at least 3 individuals who appear to have been coordinating with Karen on intelligence gathering and operational planning. We're issuing warrants this afternoon. David emerged from his home studio carrying printouts of social media posts that had been circulating since Karen's arrest became national news. Alex, you need to see this. There are residents from other communities where Karen held leadership positions, and they're reporting similar suspicious activities. The social media response had created an unexpected source of evidence for the federal investigation. Residents from Arizona, Nevada, and Colorado were sharing stories about Karen's tenure in their communities, and the pattern was consistent everywhere: unauthorized home inspections, suspicious security assessments, and increased property crime rates during her time in leadership positions. Agent Walsh arrived that afternoon with a team of investigators and evidence that would expand Karen's charges beyond anything we'd initially imagined. She'd been operating what could only be described as a multi-state criminal enterprise that used community leadership positions to facilitate systematic burglary operations across the Southwest. The financial analysis shows that Karen received payments from multiple sources during her time in each community, Agent Walsh explained as she spread out banking records across David's dining table. These payments were structured to avoid detection and appear to be proceeds from property theft operations. The scope was staggering. Over 8 years, Karen had earned approximately $400,000 from criminal activities while maintaining the appearance of being a dedicated community volunteer. She'd used her legitimate leadership positions to plan and execute crimes that had victimized hundreds of families across multiple states. Agent Walsh, how did she avoid detection for so long? The beauty of her operation was its legitimacy cover. She was an elected community leader, conducting what appeared to be official inspections and assessments. Residents trusted her because she held positions of authority, and law enforcement agencies didn't connect property crimes across different jurisdictions. Detective Ramirez added another layer to the investigation that made Karen's operation seem even more calculating. We've discovered that she specifically targeted communities with high property values and low law enforcement presence. She was selecting locations that offered maximum criminal opportunity with minimal risk of detection. The victim impact was becoming clearer as more residents came forward with reports of suspicious activities during Karen's inspections. Mrs. Goldman from Sunset Ridge Drive provided testimony that showed Karen's intelligence gathering had been comprehensive and invasive. She photographed everything in my house, including personal documents and family photos. She asked questions about my insurance coverage, my travel schedule, and even my medication routine. I thought she was being thorough about community safety, but now I realize she was planning to rob me. The psychological manipulation was as sophisticated as the criminal planning. Karen had used residents' trust in community authority to gain access to information and locations that would have been impossible to obtain through conventional criminal means. David's reaction to the expanding investigation was immediate and decisive. Agent Walsh, I want to do whatever I can to help prosecute this case. If Karen was running similar operations in other communities, there are victims across multiple states who deserve justice. Mr. David, we may need you to testify about the surveillance you documented and the criminal planning evident in the materials she brought to your home. Your security footage provides some of our best evidence of her systematic reconnaissance activities. That afternoon, Karen's court-appointed attorney made what would prove to be the final attempt at mounting a defense. Attorney Robert Sterling filed motions claiming that Karen's activities were legitimate HOA business that had been misinterpreted by federal investigators. The defense strategy was predictably desperate. Sterling argued that community leaders had broad authority to inspect properties and assess security issues, and that any criminal intent was a misunderstanding of her duties and responsibilities. It was a legal argument that collapsed under the weight of evidence almost immediately. Agent Walsh's response brief was devastating. She presented Karen's surveillance files, her professional locksmith equipment, her detailed burglary planning documents, and financial records showing criminal proceeds from multiple states over 8 years. The defendants claim that breaking into a resident's home at 2 a.m. with professional burglary tools constitutes legitimate HOA business is not supported by any statute, regulation, or legal precedent in any jurisdiction, Agent Walsh wrote in her filing. The federal judge reviewing the case was equally unimpressed. Judge Robert Martinez denied all defense motions and scheduled Karen for a competency evaluation to determine whether she understood the serious nature of the charges against her. The defendant appears to be claiming that elected community positions provide immunity from criminal law and authority to commit felonies under the guise of civic duty, Judge Martinez noted in his ruling. This represents either fundamental misunderstanding of legal authority or deliberate criminal enterprise disguised as community service. Meanwhile, the investigation was revealing additional victims across multiple states. Property crime databases showed unusual patterns during Karen's tenure in each community she'd targeted, with sophisticated burglaries increasing significantly while she held leadership positions. The Colorado Attorney General's office announced they were opening a parallel investigation into Karen's activities in Denver area communities. Arizona and Nevada investigators were reviewing similar cases. What had started as one breaking and entering arrest was becoming a multi-state prosecution of organized criminal enterprise. Mrs. Patterson from David's community called that evening with information that showed Karen's operation had been even more systematic than the FBI investigation had initially revealed. "Mr. Thompson, I've been going through my home security footage from the past year, and Karen appears on camera at least 15 different times conducting surveillance of my property." "What kind of surveillance?" "She was photographing my windows, testing door locks, and timing when I left for work and returned home. She was building a complete intelligence profile for burglarizing my house, and I never suspected because she was always wearing her tennis outfit and carrying that official-looking clipboard." The pattern was consistent across multiple households. Karen had spent months conducting systematic surveillance operations while residents assumed she was performing legitimate community duties. The scope of intelligence gathering suggested she'd been planning coordinated burglary operations that could have netted hundreds of thousands of dollars in stolen property. Agent Walsh updated the charges Tuesday morning. Karen now faced federal counts of organized criminal enterprise, burglary, criminal conspiracy, wire fraud, money laundering, and racketeering across multiple jurisdictions. The potential sentence had increased to 35 to 40 years in federal prison. "This is now one of the largest community-based criminal enterprises we've prosecuted," Agent Walsh told reporters at a press conference outside the courthouse. The defendant used positions of civic trust to facilitate systematic property crimes spanning 8 years in 4 states. As Tuesday evening arrived, Karen was sitting in federal detention facing what amounted to a life sentence for turning community leadership into criminal opportunity. Her legal defense had collapsed under the weight of evidence, her criminal network was being dismantled by federal investigators, and her victims were finally getting the justice they deserved. The investigation would continue for months, but Karen's days of exploiting community trust for criminal gain were permanently over. Sometimes the most dangerous criminals are the ones who hide behind legitimate authority and civic responsibility. And sometimes justice comes through the simple recognition that no position or title provides immunity from the consequences of criminal behavior. Karen Whitmore had spent years believing that community leadership made her untouchable. Federal prosecutors were proving her very wrong, one felony charge at a time. 3 months later, I sat in the federal courthouse in downtown Los Angeles, watching Karen Whitmore's defense attorney make what could only be described as the most hopeless opening statement in recent legal memory. Karen herself sat at the defendant's table, wearing an orange detention uniform that had replaced her signature tennis outfit, her hands folded as her lawyer tried to convince a jury that systematic criminal enterprise was actually misguided community service. The trial had attracted national media attention not just because of David's celebrity status, but because Karen's case had become a symbol of how trusted community positions could be exploited for sophisticated criminal operations. Legal experts were calling it a landmark prosecution for organized crime disguised as civic leadership. Federal prosecutor Jessica Martinez opened with a statement that set the tone for everything that would follow. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the defendant didn't just break into one home on one night. She spent 8 years building a criminal empire that used community trust as a weapon against the very people who elected her to protect them." The prosecution's case was overwhelming. They presented evidence of Karen's operations across 4 states, involving systematic surveillance of hundreds of homes, criminal intelligence gathering disguised as community inspections, and financial records showing nearly $500,000 in criminal proceeds over 8 years. David testified on the second day, describing how security footage had revealed months of systematic surveillance of his property. His testimony was calm and professional, but the impact on the jury was obvious when they saw edited footage of Karen conducting reconnaissance operations while wearing her tennis outfit and carrying official-looking documentation. "She wasn't just planning one burglary," David explained to the jury. "She was building a complete intelligence profile of my home, my routines, and my security systems while I trusted her as an elected community leader." The most damaging testimony came from residents across multiple states who described how Karen had gained access to their homes through fabricated HOA requirements. Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield, the the elderly resident whose testimony had been crucial in exposing Karen's operation, took the stand with obvious difficulty but unwavering determination. She photographed my jewelry, my art collection, and my prescription medications while telling me it was required for community insurance compliance. Mrs. Whitfield testified, "I trusted her because she was our president, and she used that trust to plan crimes against me." The defense strategy was predictably desperate. Attorney Robert Sterling argued that Karen's activities represented overzealous community management rather than criminal intent, and that any surveillance activities were legitimate security assessments authorized by her elected position. The argument collapsed under cross-examination when Prosecutor Martinez presented Karen's professional locksmith equipment, detailed burglary planning documents, and financial records showing structured payments designed to avoid detection. Mr. Sterling, Prosecutor Martinez said during cross-examination of the defense's expert witness, "Can you point to any statute, regulation, or legal precedent that authorizes elected community leaders to break into residents' homes at 2 a.m. using professional burglary tools?" The expert witness, a former HOA management consultant, was forced to admit that no such authority existed under any interpretation of community leadership law, but the trial's most dramatic moment came when Agent Walsh presented evidence of Karen's criminal network. 3 accomplices had been arrested in coordinated raids across Arizona and Colorado, and their testimony revealed the systematic nature of Karen's operation. The defendant recruited accomplices with specific skills, Agent Walsh explained to the jury: a locksmith who installed sophisticated entry tools, a security consultant who helped analyze surveillance footage, and a fence who laundered proceeds from stolen property. The accomplice testimony was devastating. Professional locksmith Thomas Bradley described how Karen had paid him to create untraceable entry tools and modify community access systems to facilitate unauthorized entry. Security consultant Maria Santos testified about analyzing residents' protection systems to identify vulnerabilities for criminal exploitation. She wasn't just collecting information randomly, Santos testified. She was building systematic intelligence profiles for coordinated burglary operations targeting the most vulnerable and valuable properties in each community. Karen's reaction to the testimony showed someone who'd finally realized the scope of her legal exposure. She sat motionless at the defense table, occasionally whispering to her attorney, but mostly staring at evidence displays that documented 8 years of criminal enterprise with professional thoroughness. The financial evidence presented by FBI forensic accountants showed that Karen's criminal operation had generated nearly $600,000 in proceeds when including property she'd personally stolen during her unauthorized inspections. The money had been laundered through multiple accounts and used to fund her lifestyle while she maintained the appearance of being a dedicated volunteer. The defendant lived well beyond her legitimate income by systematically stealing from the communities that trusted her with leadership, Prosecutor Martinez explained during closing arguments. She turned civic responsibility into criminal opportunity and community service into personal enrichment. The defense's closing argument was a last-ditch attempt to portray Karen as someone whose community dedication had been misunderstood and criminalized by overzealous federal prosecutors. Sterling argued that her activities represented legitimate governance that had been misinterpreted as criminal enterprise. The jury deliberated for exactly 4 hours and 37 minutes. Guilty on all counts, the foreman announced, his voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom. Karen's reaction was immediate and devastating. She slumped forward as if physically struck, the reality of federal conviction hitting her with the force of someone who'd spent months denying the obvious evidence against her. Judge Robert Martinez scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later, but his immediate comments suggested Karen would be facing the maximum penalties available under federal sentencing guidelines. Ms. Whitmore, you held positions of trust in multiple communities across multiple states, and you used that trust to systematically victimize the people who elected you to protect them. Your crimes represent not just theft and burglary, but a fundamental betrayal of civic responsibility that strikes at the heart of how communities function. Outside the courthouse, the media response was immediate and comprehensive. Legal experts called the conviction a watershed moment for community accountability and HOA governance reform. Community advocates celebrated what they called long-overdue justice for systematic abuse of elected authority. David's statement to reporters captured the broader significance of the case. This trial proved that no one is above the law, regardless of their position or the trust placed in them by their community. Karen Whitmore used leadership as a license for criminal behavior, and today, justice held her accountable. The victim impact extended far beyond the immediate crimes. Residents from 4 states had testified about the lasting psychological effects of discovering that their trusted leader had been planning to victimize them. The betrayal of community trust had created trauma that would take years to heal. Mrs. Whitfield, who traveled from Malibu to witness the verdict, spoke to reporters about the relief of seeing justice served. For months, I blamed myself for being too trusting and too naive. Today I learned that the problem wasn't my trust, it was her criminal exploitation of that trust. As the trial concluded, I reflected on how Karen's arrest at David's house had uncovered one of the most sophisticated community-based criminal enterprises in recent memory. What started as mysterious motion sensor alerts had exposed systematic criminal operations that had victimized hundreds of families across multiple states. The sentencing hearing would determine how many years Karen would spend in federal prison, but her days of exploiting community trust for criminal gain were permanently over. The communities she'd targeted were implementing reforms designed to prevent similar exploitation, and law enforcement agencies were using her case as a template for identifying and prosecuting comparable operations. Sometimes justice comes through complex investigations and federal prosecution, sometimes it comes through community courage and victim advocacy, and sometimes it comes through the simple recognition that positions of trust carry real responsibilities that can't be violated without serious consequences. Karen Whitmore had spent 8 years believing that community leadership provided immunity from criminal law. The jury's verdict had proven her catastrophically wrong. 6 weeks after the verdict, I sat in the same federal courthouse where Karen's conviction had made national headlines, watching Judge Robert Martinez deliver a sentence that would reverberate through community governance across the country. Karen appeared at the defendant's table wearing the same orange detention uniform, but something fundamental had changed. The defiant authority that had defined her interactions with residents and law enforcement had been replaced by the hollow expression of someone who'd finally understood the consequences of 8 years of systematic criminal enterprise. The sentencing hearing had drawn representatives from law enforcement agencies across 4 states, community advocates who'd used Karen's case to push for HOA reform, and dozens of victims who'd traveled to witness the conclusion of a criminal operation that had violated their trust and invaded their privacy. Judge Martinez opened the proceedings with comments that would be quoted in legal textbooks for years to come. Mrs. Whitmore, you didn't just commit individual crimes against individual victims, you systematically betrayed the fundamental principles that make community governance possible. You turned positions of trust into instruments of criminal exploitation. The victim impact statements were devastating. Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield, now using a walker but determined to see justice delivered, testified about the lasting psychological trauma of discovering that her trusted community leader had been planning to rob her blind. Your Honor, I haven't felt safe in my own home since learning that Karen photographed my belongings while I believed she was protecting my community. The violation of trust has been harder to recover from than any material loss could have been. David's victim impact statement focused on the broader implications of Karen's crimes for community safety and governance. Your Honor, this case isn't just about one person's criminal behavior, it's about the systematic abuse of civic responsibility that threatens how communities function and how neighbors trust each other. The federal sentencing guidelines for organized criminal enterprise, combined with the multi-state scope and sophisticated nature of Karen's operation, resulted in a sentence that would effectively end her criminal career permanently. Judge Martinez sentenced Karen to 38 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation with permanent restrictions on any community leadership roles. Whitmore, your crimes spanned 8 years, 4 states, and hundreds of victims. You used positions of civic trust to facilitate systematic criminal operations that violated the basic principles of community safety and mutual respect. This sentence reflects not just punishment for past crimes, but protection for future communities from similar exploitation. Karen's reaction was immediate and complete. She collapsed forward at the defense table, her body shaking with the kind of sobs that come from someone who'd finally realized that their actions had permanent, irreversible consequences. At 35 years old, she would likely spend the rest of her productive adult life in federal custody. The aftermath extended far beyond Karen's personal destruction. Her case had triggered the most comprehensive reform of HOA governance in decades, with new federal requirements for background screening, financial oversight, and community accountability that would protect residents from similar criminal exploitation. Agent Walsh announced at a post-sentencing press conference that Karen's prosecution had become a template for identifying and prosecuting community-based criminal enterprises nationwide. Mrs. Whitmore's case has fundamentally changed how we understand the intersection of civic leadership and criminal opportunity. The investigation had ultimately identified 127 victims across 4 states, with total losses exceeding $800,000 in stolen property and surveillance violations. Restitution orders would ensure that Karen's prison wages and any future assets would be used to compensate the communities and individuals she'd victimized. But perhaps the most significant impact was cultural. Karen's case had sparked a national conversation about community governance, trust, and accountability that was changing how HOA boards operated across the country. Background screening, financial transparency, and regular oversight were becoming standard practices in communities that had previously relied on trust and good faith. Malibu Vista Estates had been transformed from a community terrorized by their elected leader into a model of transparent governance and mutual accountability. Property values had actually increased as families sought out neighborhoods with reputations for ethical leadership and community cooperation. Mrs. Patterson, who discovered months of surveillance footage showing Karen's criminal reconnaissance of her property, had become a national advocate for HOA reform. What happened in our community could happen anywhere that people assume elected leaders are automatically trustworthy, she told a congressional hearing on community governance. The annual Community Safety and Accountability Conference, established in response to Karen's case, brought together law enforcement, legal experts, and community leaders to discuss preventing similar criminal exploitation of civic positions. The conference featured Karen's case as a primary example of how sophisticated criminals could exploit community trust for systematic criminal enterprise. David's security consulting business had expanded to focus specifically on community-based threat assessment and prevention. The most dangerous criminals are often the ones who hide behind legitimate authority, he explained to community leaders learning to identify and prevent similar exploitation. A year after sentencing, I received a letter from the federal prison where Karen was serving her sentence. The envelope was thin, the handwriting uncertain, and the message was brief. I finally understand what community leadership was supposed to mean. I'm sorry it took federal prison to teach me that lesson. I showed the letter to David, who read it with the expression of someone who'd found closure he didn't know he was seeking. Do you think she actually learned something? Hard to say, but I hope so. The woman who wrote that letter sounds different from the one who was planning to rob our entire neighborhood while serving as their elected president. Are you going to respond? David thought about it for a long moment. No, some conversations end when they end. Karen Whitmore made her choices over 8 years of criminal activity, and she's living with the consequences. That's how accountability works. 3 years after the trial, Karen's case had fundamentally changed community governance across America. Her mugshot still appeared in training materials for HOA boards, usually accompanied by detailed analysis of how positions of civic trust could be exploited for criminal purposes. The Federal Community Leadership Accountability Act, passed in response to her case, established mandatory background screening and oversight requirements for all residential community governance positions. The law was known informally as the Whitmore Act, ensuring that her legacy would be permanent protection for the communities she'd tried to exploit. The house where Karen had conducted her 2 a.m. breaking and entering attempt had become something of a landmark in discussions of home security and community safety. David still lived there, but the property now hosted the annual California Community Safety Summit, where law enforcement and community leaders learned to identify and prevent criminal exploitation of civic positions. But perhaps the most lasting impact was the cultural shift in how communities approached leadership accountability. Karen's case had proven that community positions carried real legal responsibilities, that residents had rights that couldn't be violated by criminal exploitation of authority, and that systematic abuse of civic trust would face serious federal prosecution. From my office at David's house, I could see the front entrance where Karen had used professional locksmith tools to break in while we waited inside with federal agents. The area had been converted into a memorial garden dedicated to community healing and accountability, with a plaque reading, "In honor of communities that choose transparency over exploitation, service over self-interest, and justice over impunity." Sometimes justice is a 38-year federal sentence and hundreds of thousands of dollars in restitution. Sometimes it's communities learning to govern themselves with transparency and accountability. Sometimes it's the recognition that leadership positions exist to serve others, not to exploit them. Karen Whitmore had tried to build a criminal empire by systematically exploiting community trust and victimizing the people who'd elected her to protect them. Her downfall had created a nationwide movement for accountability, transparency, and ethical governance that would protect communities for generations. The breaking and entering had lasted 17 minutes. The criminal enterprise had spanned 8 years across 4 states. The reforms triggered by her prosecution would protect community governance forever. Karen's story ended in a federal prison cell, her authority permanently stripped away and her criminal operations permanently dismantled. The story of the communities she'd victimized began with healing, reform, and the recognition that real leadership serves communities instead of preying on them. The security system chimed softly each evening as I locked David's house, a daily reminder that some protection comes from technology, but the most important security comes from communities that choose ethical leadership and hold that leadership accountable to the people they serve. Justice had been served, communities had been protected, and Karen Whitmore's criminal legacy had become a cautionary tale that would safeguard future residents from similar predators who mistook civic authority for criminal opportunity. The end of her story was imprisonment and disgrace. The beginning of community protection was everything that came after.